If you go into SEO not trying to be the best, it's a waste of time. Everything starts with distribution. It is a zero-sum game. What are the questions that are going to come up? You have to take an active stance towards finding the opportunities or creating the opportunities where you can put your best foot forward. The rare unicorn that actually does some performance testing. I've never been the guy who could tell you what Google's last update was. I don't pay attention to jack shit. If I just write better content, Google's going to get better at finding my content. There's no reason to try to game Google. You might as well be throwing money into the trash can. You look for the select moments where you do a little more work than the client deserves, but you're doing it so you can test your chops on a really high-end piece. Since we have a lot of freelancers watching this, pick your battles.
So let's just jump straight into it. Tell me about your content marketing philosophy.
Yeah, so my content marketing philosophy is kind of two parts. One, distribution first. So everything starts with distribution. How are we reaching the end reader, the end user? Who are we speaking to? And then how can we create the best content on the internet? The best content anywhere to attract readers through that distribution channel. And it's kind of that simple. It's just about, who are we reaching? How are we going to reach them? And how do we create the best thing available to reach them?
Okay. So the best thing, this is very subjective. How do we
It is.
define what do we define as the best? How are we reverse engineering these distribution channels? And I've got my own ideas on this, but how's that working for you? Tell me about that process.
Totally. So there's a subjective element, and then there's also an objective part to it. So subjectively, there's just, the idea of, is this impressive? Is what we're creating more impressive? Is it more attention grabbing? Is it more comprehensive than everything that's out there? Are we putting the work in to really make this exceptional directly in comparison to the other content that's out there? Now, as you mentioned, that is subjective. Some people will look at multiple pieces of content and come away with different ideas about what's better. So that is also paired with the more objective element of, how is this performing for the distribution that we have chosen? So SEO, very simple. Is it ranking in the top three and then converting leads or whatever other purpose that we are wanting, to have the content do? Social, is it, bringing in engagement and then turning into leads from there? Sometimes tracking leads with social is a little more tricky. So you might just focus more on driving engagement and followers to the channel or to your page or your profile or whatever it is. Different distribution calls for different objectives and has different standards or metrics of success. And so you have to combine those two. If there is content that ranks that if you were to look at it, you wouldn't necessarily think this is very good. And in that case, I don't think you're hitting the mark, even if you're ranking. And you'll often see with posts like that, you look at what's ranking in the top couple posts for whatever reason, maybe it's link building, things like that. You go in, if you're unimpressed with the content, it's probably not going to result in, you signing up for a lead magnet or whatever, getting on a call, scheduling a demo, whatever the conversion objective is, even if you're ranking, it's not going to be reached. So it's a combination of those two things. And it's a combination of a subjective and objective element. And kind of on that note too, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what what the definition of success is there.
Yeah, for sure. So the way that I like to think about it, and I'm glad you asked, is content to me has one of four goals, right? And you have to create with one of these goals specifically in mind. One is to generate conversation. The other one is to generate, oh God, now you put me on the spot. So to drive conversation, to drive shares, to drive leads, or to drive sales.
Yeah.
And if you are doing one of those things and one of those things specifically, you have a very, very clear idea of what it is that you're trying to do. And then all the other stuff in my mind becomes a downstream success metric. So if your whole idea is to drive discussion, right? You're going to generate traffic as a result of the discussion that you're trying to start because people want to engage with it. You might drive shares, which is great, but that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to start a conversation. So if you're creating with that in mind and reverse engineering your distribution channel to create that subjective, and I want to dig into that a little bit more, something that is subjectively worth having a conversation about, then you have this sort of very narrow thing that you're going, this is what's successful. I think, does that answer the question for you?
Totally. And
Yeah.
in copywriting, we kind of have this concept that any piece of copy needs to have one objective, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're trying to do multiple things, you're going to be less effective at any one of them. And
Right.
I think the exact same should be true for content as well. There should be one single primary objective, and then everything else becomes, like you mentioned, a downhill
Yeah.
objective or benefit. But you're using that number one objective as the metric that you use to gauge success.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's something that's interesting to me. And this is, I think it's related, but we're talking about subjectivity. And I know you're a huge SEO person, right? Like you've got a very strong SEO background. You've done a lot there. There's a lot of conversation around what's happening with SEO these days. But something that I know from seeing you in some of the services that I've tried to compete with you in, um, is they are subjectively better in those positions than some of the other Me Too type content that goes out there. How are you infusing more soul, right? Which is really what it is, balancing the soul with the making the big G happy.
Yeah. I think I think it just comes down to like taking the search intent more seriously than anyone else. Um, there, I saw a tweet. I think it's, I think his name's Brooklyn Nash.
Nash, he was on our
Yeah,
show. Yeah.
yeah. I see his profile picture and I just kind of have the mental image. I couldn't remember like if I was pronouncing his name right. But like he was talking about how one, it was kind of a two-part thing. He made a joke about how content marketing is just easier journalism that is paid better.
Hmm.
And then later he tweeted about how he read a Harvard Business Review article, and then instead of just parroting what was said in this article from a few years back, he reached out to the Harvard professor who was quoted in the article and asked him if he would be open to sharing like an updated take for 2022.
Yeah.
And the guy was like, yeah, and agreed to come on and actually be interviewed by him. And so like to me, what that represents is that's an attitude that's not, I need to come up with information to fill an article or to fill an objective or to get this piece shipped. It's I'm going to go find the best possible information out there and create the most useful, the most up to date, the most relevant, the most authoritative piece that I can make to answer this, search intent. Um, and that's the approach that I've tried to bring to content, both with my own stuff and to a more limited degree with freelance clients, and then now definitely in house. Um, Obviously, when you're working freelance, you have budget restrictions and things like that that go into just how much time you can invest in hitting that top quality. But for my own site, like I have articles up there that I spent 60 hours putting together,
Hmm.
a single blog post. And like you create a moat for yourself when you do that in some ways just by the legwork, because who else is going to invest 60 hours into a piece of content? There's
Right.
not many people. And even if you do finally find someone who does, there's not as, you're going to have potentially, months, potentially years ahead in terms of a head start on them. So it's just like going into going into this content and really thinking, how can I create something more useful? I like to think of any sort of instructional or how-to content. I like to imagine myself teaching a classroom of people and asking like, what's the context that I need to create? What are the questions that are going to come up? If I was teaching this live, what would people be raising their hands and asking along the way? And which of those things should I take the time to really dig into in this piece? Which are things that make more sense to, you know, kind of play off to another article, something like that. But just really approaching it from the reader standpoint, from the user standpoint of what are they looking for? What is the search demand here? And how can I genuinely make something that is more helpful in answering this question, more helpful in delivering this result than anything else online? And you just, over the years, I've seen a lot of people um, say they want to do that. But when it comes to actually investing in doing that, they're never willing to actually, to go the extra mile, to invest the extra dollar, to spend the extra hour, really delivering on what they feel is going to be the best output.
Yeah, and what it sounds like you're saying too is that you're taking a step beyond just remixing all of the remixing, then remixing all the remixing that's happening in most of the search results. Now,
Yeah.
here's something that's interesting to me because we've talked about this on the show quite a bit too. Um, how are you infusing not just that soul, but also the perspective, right? Because that's what lacks, I think, in a lot of content marketing. And I think what really lacks, and maybe this is kind of a second part two to this question, right? How are you injecting that perspective, but then also coming from a freelance background? How are you talking to people about allowing that perspective to exist? Because a lot of freelancers that I know have had that beaten out of them that they're not allowed to have a perspective. They have to play it safe. So kind of part one, part two, go.
Yeah. So I think the part one to that is, um, you always want to have on the ground expertise
Yep.
infiltrate in your content. So obviously in doing the stuff that I have on my website, it's, I I was a freelance copywriter for 10 years,
Right.
so like that's all firsthand. Anything I'm talking about in that, it comes from direct firsthand experience. So that's easy there. When you're talking about a freelance environment or more recently, what I've been tackling at owner.com, one of the big reasons that I was interested in going in-house with them is they brought me in contract to do this like kind of like 4-page super guide. Um, and as I was building that, like they have so much on the ground restauranting experience and restaurant marketing experience on the team that like if you read through, and I actually recently, like we just published this guide, and if you go through it, it's 25,000 words between the 4 pages. You go through that, every single line of that is like proven on the ground information. And this is all coming from I wrote this thing uh, having zero restaurant marketing experience, but I have enough marketing experience to understand the um, I guess the substance of what's happening. And
Yeah.
so instead of me just like trying to like pull stuff out of my ass to fill in something that I don't know, I was working hand in hand with people who have actually done all this. And we're also coming from like 2 years of firsthand data with thousands of restaurants through the platform. So every little piece of this is from real data, from real marketing, from real restaurant growth. And finding a way to tap into that is, I think, even just having the attitude that that's what I'm going to find instead of I'm just going to make something up or remix something from what I find on the front page. You know, that's the difference between the 95% of content that nobody will ever read and the 5% that drives billions of dollars in revenue, across, niches and locations and industries. Um, and to kind of connect that to part two of what you asked, how do you handle that as a freelancer? Um, and the answer is sometimes you just don't. Like if you're getting paid $100 for a post, like it doesn't make sense to be
Right.
doing, like it's just you don't have the budget to put that time into it. And so what you're being paid for when
Right.
you're
In that case, let me ask you a better question then.
yeah.
All right. How are you managing that expectation upwards? Right. Not necessarily from the freelancer perspective, but from maybe an on the ground in-house content marketer perspective. How are you saying upward, hey, we need to have a perspective that we can take?
I don't think I'm fully understanding your question on perspective.
Sure. So let me just jump on here. So in a lot of situations, I've seen this with a lot of in-house executive teams, or even leadership teams are afraid to take a position where it's, this is who we're for and this is who we're not,
Mm,
right? Or this is our stance on the market. So instead of going, you know, hey, here's what we think, SEO is dead, right? We'll just say that some companies might not be willing to, Hrefs, for example, might not be willing to take something that has that strong of a point of view,
mm,
right?
yeah.
How, as somebody on the ground, are you encouraging or would encourage somebody to say upwards, manage upwards, to say, we need to take a perspective, we need to take a stand?
Yeah, so that kind of directly connects into what I was just mentioning.
Yeah.
I think part of the trick of being a successful freelancer is holding in balance a growing understanding of what you're aiming for with the reality of what you're dealing with in the present.
Okay.
Um, so, for example, there's going to be the vast majority of situations you will have as a freelancer, you are not going to have buy in for greater investment for quality. You are not going to have the budget to really do everything that you'd like to be able to do to make this the best piece possible. You are not going to have the license to say what you want to say, to take a stance, to bring perspective. Um, and the key there is you have to be able to exist in that environment and make your money in that environment while still aiming and working towards something better.
Hmm.
You have to be able to um, you have to take an active stance towards finding the opportunities or creating the opportunities for yourself where you can put your best foot forward. I had times where I would put more investment into an unpaid article, an unpaid guest post, than I would into a paid piece of content because I was I was taking the initiative to put my best work on a certain publication that I wanted to attract, my target market, people
Hmm.
who I thought would be interested in investing in a higher quality of writing. Similarly, I had, points in my career, one in particular where I took a 40% pay cut to put most of my attention on a single client that I knew would give me the opportunity to do my best work and to really see what I could do on, in this case, in a SEO and content marketing vein. And so, like, finding the opportunities to work on the projects that are going to let you really go at it, while still not like burning yourself out trying to deliver $1,000 work on a $200 budget.
Right.
That's part of the balance of being a freelancer is you know go get paid, do you know do what you need to do on the gigs that are available to you while continuing to keep your mind thinking about how could I do better and how can I go secure the type of clientele that will let me do better and will pay me to do better.
And eventually moving yourself into more of a consultative role instead of a transactional role, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Um, Now I want to take some of that, and let's move on to the next part of the thing. Let's talk about your process and how that plays into the planning process for the content that you're going to create, both on a macro level for like an entire calendar, but also on a micro level for an individual piece.
Yeah, so up to this point, my wheelhouse is SEO.
Okay.
Um, so my process is very specific to SEO. And in that, I'm looking for, what's the search intent? What are the keyword opportunities? And then beyond the keyword opportunities, how does it connect to non-keyword driven content? Because one of the things that's nice about when you're building these sort of, you know, uh, what is it? Spoken wheel,
Yeah. Hub and spoke.
hub and
Hub and
spoke.
spoke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're creating these like interconnected like content silos, you can kind of do a mixture of SEO driven stuff and stuff that you feel is more nurturing stuff that doesn't necessarily because SEO is the start of bringing in email leads, so it's very connected with the email marketing on the back end. So you can create content that doesn't need to rank. That's going to be going to nurture people who did come in through the rankings. So you can kind of create these mixtures, but just finding what is the demand, what are people asking? What are people looking for? What is the information they need? How does it connect to what I'm selling? That whole process is where it starts. Um, and
Question for you.
yeah,
Got to jump right in there. How are you thinking about intent? Right? We batted this term around a lot in our industry,
yeah.
but there's I know what I do, which is like, okay, I think I see the key phrases, but then like I have to meditate on why somebody would search for that. What are you doing? What's your process for that?
Honestly, it's mostly just common sense is
Okay.
how I approach it. I don't really have anything more sophisticated than that. When I look, and the caveat there is common sense in a way that like you you accept what Google's telling you sometimes, and you reject what Google's telling you other times. So like for example, sometimes you look up a keyword and it's very clear what Google feels is the intent of that keyword based on what's ranking. It's,
Yep.
you got like 10 different articles that are all essentially going in the same direction. In spaces like that, it's usually Google's accurate about what people are looking for. And so your job then is simply to make a better version of what's there. Um, in other cases, sometimes you get a mixture of things. And in those cases, it's not uncommon for none of the things ranking on the page, when you think of it in a common sense, perspective, to actually be fitting what's being asked or what's being searched. And so when you kind of bring common sense to the table with those, sometimes you can just leapfrog all that content by creating something that's actually answering the question in that search. Um, and you really run into that a lot when you're talking about searches that um, don't have like a tremendous amount of like volume, but maybe have like higher intent, like more low volume, high intent type stuff that is getting picked up by content that's not really aimed at it. It's aimed at adjacent stuff. And so you can come in there and make something a little more targeted, a little more of a scalpel approach, I like to call it, and just and nab this little batch of high intent searches by creating something that no one else is really creating for that query.
I love that. And that is a fantastic answer. I want to, we need to get into, let's talk about your pregame, right? You've thought all of this through. You've had this sort of macro approach. You've thought through the intent. You've written the piece, or you've gotten somebody else to write the piece. What's your pregame before editing your article? And then we'll jump into the edit from there. And I do want to encourage everybody too. Please feel free to ask any questions along the way. This is an excellent opportunity to pick Jacob's brain.
So my approach for editing other people's content is a bit different than for editing my own, because I'm more of a first draft editor than a second draft editor on my own content. So
Okay.
I very much like redo what I'm doing along the way. Um, it's not uncommon for me to like get 75% of the way through a piece or a collection of pieces and then realize there's a better way to structure it, and like just like break everything apart and rebuild it, delete pieces, add pieces in. Um, and that all happens before I really formally finish the first draft.
Hmm.
Um, so there's that. I don't, I, I can't really add a whole lot there. When it comes to editing other pieces, kind of like what we'll do, what we'll show here. Um, I'm really just looking for, um, like, what's the purpose of this piece, and are we hitting that purpose? And along the way, are we thinking about how the reader is going to engage with the piece along the way? And that's just something you'll see even with the piece that we're about to edit. There's a lot of really amazing core content and thought leadership in this piece, and it's just being structured and delivered in a way that does not really facilitate the reader.
Hmm.
And so that's mostly what I'm looking at. The other thing is, if there's a if I'm evaluating writing skill as I'm going through and editing it, I'm looking for, is the core substance there? I mean, that's really, once you know what you're trying to aim at, that's kind of the core, the first and foremost thing is this worth reading?
Right.
Is there information here that is worth taking the time to read. Fortunately, in the piece you sent me to edit, that the answer is absolutely yes. So it's like the perfect example of, really great core content. We just need to restructure and adjust some things to deliver it in the way that it should be delivered.
I try with the articles that we give our guests to have something like that because there
10 for 10,
definitely,
Tommy.
yeah, there are definitely things where you're like, there are like three things in here. It could have been 5 words, right? We've got 800 words that surround one 5 word or idea. We have a question in here, which is, what are your top 3 tools for search intent insights?
top top 3 tools.
Top 3 tools.
Um,
We'll start with your top one and then see if anything else comes from there.
I'm a big Ahrefs stan, as they
Yeah.
say. Um, I've been using them forever, and I haven't found anything better. ahrefs.com. If you're not familiar with it, it's just kind of an all-in-one SEO tool. Um, I mostly just use them. Occasionally, I'll use. I think it's iSpion, iSpionage or iSpionage or
SBI?
iSpiona. Yeah, espionage or espionage, I think
I see
actually
it.
was
Okay.
correct to say. Um, to look at to evaluate a site, like what a site's doing from a PPC perspective, because
Yeah.
obviously there's some interplay with SEO and AdWords and things like that. But for the most part, in creating content, I'm all evaluated just with the one tool. I'm not like a full stack SEO tools guy. I also have like never, and I've been doing SEO for 10 years. I've never been the guy who like could tell you what Google's last update was. Like I don't pay attention to jack shit on anything technical. Like for me, it just seemed like people wasted so much energy on that. Like my thing was like, if I just write better content, Google's going to progressively get better at finding my content over the years, like, so there's no reason to try to game Google. I'm just going to create the best content and subjectively the best content and see what happens. Whether through sheer ignorance or I'm just a genius, it's worked out, so one or the other, maybe both at the same time.
Oh, I'm gonna piggyback on that for a second. One of the
Yeah.
things that I will say is I use Ahrefs a lot. I like that for doing the keyword research and finding all that. The other thing that I'll do is match that up against what I'm seeing on Twitter for similar key phrases and also like Reddit or Quora. And I hate when other people say that, right? I hate it because it sounds like such a standard go-to answer. But I think the real thing that's interesting is finding the discussion that's happening around these actual phrases that people are using to then let that inform what the intent is behind somebody. Because like you were saying, like sometimes Google doesn't really know,
Yeah.
right?
I
Or
do. I do a lot of search term Reddit at the end.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because Reddit's insight search is so bad, but you can just use Google, and it's
yeah.
a great place to see what are people actually saying about this. What's the actual on the ground sentiment? Um,
And
I
it's
use it a
real.
little more. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
It is unfiltered.
Unfiltered. I use it a little more as a consumer than I do as an SEO.
Yeah,
But my like, yeah, when it comes to SEO, I just I don't feel like people fail at SEO because they don't know what they're supposed to do, or they don't know how to rank, or they don't know what they're actually targeting, or they're targeting the wrong keywords. Although that can be relevant. Um, I think it all ties back to what I mentioned earlier. People just like they feel that making middle of the pack content is profitable, and it's not. Like it content paid advertising, you can like just get whatever you want in front of people.
yeah,
And when we talk about SEO, it is a zero sum game. If you are not in those top 3 spots, you might as well be throwing money into the trash can. It is if you go into SEO not trying to be the best, it's a waste of time.
yeah,
And there's other games you can play where you don't have to be that good. But when it comes to SEO and SEO focused content, like you have to go into it trying to be the best in the space. And if you're not serious about making that effort, there's in my opinion, there's just no point. And it doesn't matter how much technical SEO, how many links, how much whatever, you're gonna get beat. And I know this because as someone operating on a shoestring budget, I was beating, $100 million software companies with massive SEO budgets. Like and it's not because I'm that smart. It's just I was taking more time on the content than the person who was three margins deep at the agency writing the content was actually doing. And so that's I feel like that's what SEO comes down to, is just who is taking the content more seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. And who has more, like, and this goes back to what we were saying before, who's got more soul injected into it, right? Like,
Yep.
you can't, and I've seen this with big companies, you can't phone it in. So many people phone it in, and it's just part of the cycle, part of the hamster wheel, and then it's being phoned in. All right. We are at the half hour mark. We have a ton of questions here, which I actually would love to, we'll follow up afterwards because we have
Okay.
a lot of folks on. So we'll, at the very end of the show, we'll follow up on some of these questions. All right, cool. So if you want to share your screen while you're bringing that up, just want to remind everybody that we do have a YouTube channel as well, where all of our episode replays are live. This will be going live on there tomorrow, as well as some bonus content. And we'll also be, we also have clips along the way so we can make these a little bit more digestible. Perfect. Thank you for pulling this up, and let's jump straight into it.
So
So,
can everyone see it?
yep.
Cool.
And also, if you want to follow along with the edits, we have put the document in the chat, so you can go ahead and go into there and see everything as we're going along. First impression, before we get into the individual edits, what was your first impression on a broad scale of this piece?
So the first thing I did uh, before I before I even started reading it was um, DM the author and ask what the what the intent was. So that was Andrew. Asked like what what's the distribution? I kind of wrote it here. First question we need to ask is what's the purpose of the article? How is it going to be distributed? Because like I could literally read through this whole article, have a bunch of different takes on how it's delivering, and then find out that it's a completely different objective, and my perspective up to that point was completely worthless because I'm not evaluating it based on the actual objective. Um, and so Andrew told me this, basically the goal of this was to be like more of a thought leadership process piece that's distributed via email and social. Goal being to nurture, I'm assuming for savvy revenue, their B2C e-commerce leads in Europe. The goal being to nurture email leads towards working with the company. Um, so that's the baseline here, and everything we look at from here. Using that perspective, I thought it seemed like a great piece. I love I love this. I love 100 plus audits in 2021. Just he's coming in with the real on the ground experience that makes content potentially great.
It's very, very specific, which
Yes.
signposts the rest for the rest of it. All right, cool. Let's jump in. First line, first impressions, keep going through. Let's go line by line.
Yeah, so I've gone through and highlighted different pieces and kind of my takes on them. So kind of like I mentioned here, including this just separates. It adds a threshold of experience that other people aren't going to be able to claim, or at least not accurately claim. So I love that. I love that inclusion, especially when we're talking about there's so many articles written on auditing Google Ads, right?
Right.
So, having that in, like, it catches attention. And again, like, we want to be thinking about this piece from, to me, the North Star here, unless I was misunderstanding, Andrew's DM, is y- this is going out in an email to their leads. So people who have some contact with the brand, but who have not actually started working with them. So, um, what we're thinking here, and I forgot to mention this, that the takeaways from answering that question are: one, we don't care about SEO. This is not an SEO piece. So this article, we want this to catch stakeholder attention in the inbox. We want to get them to read and engage with this piece. And we want to use this piece to establish, the brand's expertise, working on the types of companies, that these stakeholders are going to represent. So that's the big goal here. If we accomplish this, we win. If we don't, we fail. Um, so getting into that, the intro. So this is the first place, the intro talks about pretty much exclusively, we do a lot of audits and they take a long time. So the big problem with that is that this is not the actual thesis of the piece.
Okay.
Um, the point of this piece is that this is our auditing process, so that we're giving you our ads auditing framework. The thesis is the framework. It is the process, and you don't even mention like that we're going to give like you're not really focusing on we're going to give you our process. You're focusing on uh, audits take a long time. Um, so what I want to do instead with this is we want to establish the thesis that we are providing our proven framework for auditing e-commerce ad accounts. We want to emphasize all the experience that we alluded to in the headline. So, emphasizing that kind of happens here, but it's not really specific. I would want to see more specific, like elaborate a little on the 100 audits we ran. And then what we want to do is connect that to proven benefits that come as a result of that experience, because repetitions are great, but you know, um, results are what count. So repetitions don't necessarily equate to results. So if I'm a stakeholder reading this piece, I don't really care about how long it takes you to run an audit. What I want to know is like what results is your auditing process delivering? And then if they're impressive results, then I'm going to care about the process that you're about to show me. If I know that your auditing process works, then I'm going to be compelled to dig into what the actual process is. Um, and so that, right off the bat, we're kind of really missing the mark on the intro because we're not really doing any of those things. Um, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well. That's what I'm seeing on this intro, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is a common piece of feedback that I give and that I know a lot of the people who have come onto the show have given as well, is that generally speaking, the first 2 to 500 words are an author clearing their throats, right? It's this like, how can I ramp up into this idea and this concept? And then it's usually about 2 to 500 words in where somebody actually gets to the point.
So
And,
yeah, I agree.
and
Ironically, Andrew doesn't do that here. Like
right.
it's actually a pretty succinct intro. And it's got a little soul to it. It's just not really setting the stage for the rest of the piece.
Right. Well, and that's kind of what I'm saying here is that like even in this piece, it's not clearing the throat so much as like ramping up with the same cadence and tone that a lot of other places take or a lot of other authors will take, but it is kind of setting the wrong context for what the rest of it is,
Yeah.
right? And it very well could do a better job of setting up, hey, we have had X amount of lift using this framework. Here's the framework for you. And then the subtext of the rest of it being, this is really freaking hard. Hire us. So you don't have to do this, but this is what we do. So now you know full transparency that this is what's going to happen.
Yep. Absolutely. And moving into the next section, we really get into the well, sort of. It's sort of a mixture of structure, of bad structure, and the clearing the throat a little bit. So the first section, first of all, just the subheader, getting the foundation right. This is super vague, and it's kind of a throw in subheader. I would rather see at minimum like start with the right foundation, like more of an action verb, or in this case, he basically goes through 6 different things that you need to ask before you do an audit. So maybe something like 6 prerequisites to an effective audit, something like that. Something that's like immediately giving you, pulling you into the section. Um, and if we can pair a compelling intro and an intro that makes a clear promise with an opening subheader that like establishes a desirable takeaway, that's what really pulls someone into a long form post like this. And then we get into more trouble here through the rest of this section. So I'm going to kind of scroll down to give you an idea. This is all the opening section here before we get into the framework.
I
Um,
mean, can you just quantify this for me? How many words is that?
yes, I absolutely will. So I have this written in here. It is 780 words, which is 40% of the entire piece. So
That's what I'm saying.
yeah. So I actually really love, unlike a section I'll talk about later, I really love the before we get into the thesis type, opening subsection. Because you often need to set some context, especially in long form content. You need to set some context that sort of falls outside um, the scope of the thesis itself, the thesis content itself. So I love these opening little set some context sections. You'll see them on a lot of my content. The key here is that they need to be relatively brief. You don't want to bury the lead on your thesis content. And so obviously we've really missed the mark here, because this is 40% of the entire piece. Um, and what that means is we either are getting into a lot of stuff that's wholly unnecessary, or we've just misstructured the post. Because if this is all critical to the thesis content, to our framework, we can find a way to fit it into our framework content. And that's what we want to do. Either condense this section, cut out unnecessary points, or restructure the piece so that the things that we feel are necessary to talk about here are finding their way into the core content itself.
I think what's interesting is if you were to cut out those first few hundred words before we even get into the before we get started, and you just started with the before we get started, that sets the rest of it up even better. Like,
Potentially. I
like,
I do I like intros to be like 100 to 150 words max personally.
yeah,
So if you sometimes that opening section needs to be a little bit longer than that, in which case having the intro and head of it. But if you can get all that you need into the intro, you could potentially do that as well.
yeah. All right, cool. Well, let's move on to the our step by step framework section. Now we can get actually into it.
Yeah, so this is the core content of the post, at least, allegedly based on the headline. Obviously, if Andrew looks at this and goes, there's actually a lot in here that is critical to the piece, then maybe instead of changing everything I've just talked about, you change the headline and it's a little bit different of a thesis. Um, but assuming this is the thesis, this subheader again is just boring, kind of generic. Our step by step framework. I would rather do something like, the number, the 10-step audit framework we use to get certain benefits. So again, just like attaching the benefits to the content. You don't necessarily have to add the benefit in there. Even something like our 10-step, ads auditing framework. It sets expectation. You want to set expectation for what's in the section, and step by step doesn't add to the post beyond what we've said in the headline. And so then getting into this, what we see here is and this is kind of a reason that opening section took up such a large amount of the word count, is what we have here is kind of more like bulleted outline style content, you know, like
Interesting.
this looks like an outline rather than core content. And so my critique here is that, like, this is the core content. This is where we want, to explain, visualize, and elaborate on each step in this process. Um, Potentially even including like little screenshots or like case study highlights from clients that we've worked with through different pieces. So like, you say spend 40 or let's see, um, spend an hour just looking around and taking notes. What are we looking at? Like, what when you're looking through the ads account, like, what are some screenshots that you're really dialing into? Like, this is a perfect opportunity to show the screenshot with like some annotation and go, hey, like, I'm the first thing I do is I look for this piece of data and see how's this looking. Or maybe it's a little bit, broader than that. Maybe it's just more I scroll through a couple of these screens, and this is what I'm thinking as I'm looking through these. You know, there's there's a lot of language in here that's sort of the it depends type language, which in
Right.
some cases is extremely valid, but you have to find a way to be more specific within that when you're doing content. Content has to be more specific than just it depends. If not, you really don't have anything to say in your content. So digging in, getting granular here, um, that's what's going to make this, incredible content. And that's not what we're seeing here now.
It really feels like the once you actually get to the framework here, it kind of peters out. Um,
Exactly.
but what's interesting about this, right, is spend an hour just looking around and taking notes. If we kind of talk about that a little bit further up on the before we get started, right? Now we have something that can say like, here are the notes that you're going to take. Here are the places you should look. Here are like 3 or 4 different places where we try to get insights, which will then inform the rest of da 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 da. Um,
And I know from, being connected with Andrew on Twitter, like he knows his shit,
oh yeah,
like, and I can even tell in the way he structured this that like he can run a very useful audit. But obviously what you know in your head, um, like what makes content a challenge is getting that out onto a page in a way that's useful for someone else who does not have your expertise. And that's what we're not seeing here is, that the all the magic that would come from him doing a consult being somewhat translated. And the thing is, like, if he were to go through and just make an absolutely exhaustive, like, thought by thought process with every screen he's looking at, everything he's thinking through an audit, not only would that make for a stupidly comprehensive and lengthy article, almost nobody is ever going to read that. Like in a good way. And this is kind
right.
of the dichotomy of great content is especially when you're really putting out your consulting expertise, people are going to look at this, they're going to be wildly impressed at how detailed this is, and they're going to think it's going to take me too long to do this myself, and they're going to hire you. And that's what a lot, especially when we're talking about, B2B service type stuff, like when you just put everything you know out on the table, a lot of times people don't actually take the time to read through it. They read through enough of it to go, "Holy shit, this is like more of a process than I anticipated. I need to get this guy to do it for me." And so like not you're making the content more impressive for people who do really understand it and who, do get it. You're going to really establish your expertise, and for the people who don't, you're going to give them an incentive to hire you. So it kind of accomplishes multiple things, multiple goals with the same shot.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said earlier too, like the subtext is, oh my God, this is too much.
Yes.
It's just gonna cost me, it will cost me less in the long run to hire this person. Okay. So we've kind of gone through a lot of this already. What are some other thoughts that you've had as you were going through? Actually, here's a better question. Um, this is one of those scenarios where I'm starting to think about things as content with a capital C, right? Not just articles, not just blog posts. Do you feel like this might be better served as a video?
That's actually a really good point. I think probably it would. I mean, if he if it were me, and again, this is biased because I have a bias toward SEO, but if it were me and I'm going to be going through the work of laying out my process, I would do both. I would aim this at SEO as well as the email marketing goal because I mean he's kind of already targeting ads audit framework. And if there's any sort of search demand there, I would aim it at SEO. I'd expand it out to 4 or 5,000 words, whatever it needs to get through your process. Um, and I'd create a video where I walk through, I would create the video first and then pull screenshots from the video and putting together the article. But that's a great point because, he's looking, a lot of his takeaways here are you're going to be looking at the ads account for a while and thinking about things and asking questions. And so pulling up an ads account and looking at it and verbalizing the questions he's asking, the thoughts, the things he's looking for would be a really on point medium for this topic.
I'm going to take that just one step further too, not even necessarily a video, but a series of videos where you could then use that as a drip autoresponder uh, to kind of bounce off of each other, and distribution.
Absolutely.
You've got an extra layer of distribution all put in there, because if you're doing your SEO game right, you can get the YouTube version of it getting ranked and then create a small network. We didn't
100
talk about this. We've gone through the article. I think we covered that pretty well, actually. Um, I'd like to talk a little bit more about distribution and what distribution is doing for you these days, not just from the different places you can be, but also what are you learning from each of those channels and how does that feed into the content that you create?
Before we talk about that, can I just make one more comment on the content?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I just want to comment on this last little why we have the screen up.
Oh, I took the
Um,
screen down.
oh, shoot.
Sorry.
Do you want me to put it back up? Is it back up now or?
I can put it up.
Okay, cool.
I'll put it up. Maybe. All right, go ahead. Go ahead. Say what you're going to say.
Okay. So in the final section here, it's final tips for auditing accounts. And he kind of puts like a grab bag of little tips that weren't included in the core content. Um, This is an extremely common thing that I see writers doing, including experienced, talented writers. And it's like my biggest pet peeve in content. um, because to me, it's just bad structure. If there are things that should be in the thesis content of the post, put them in the body content. If there's things that aren't important enough to mention them in the body content, they shouldn't be mentioned at all. You want to use the end of the post for, driving action, delivering takeaways, trying to push people towards a console, a demo, a lead magnet sign up, whatever it is. And just putting kind of a grab bag of extra thoughts is just does not add to content. And it's kind of just it's a default for bad structure. So again, my view is if it should fit in the post, fit it in the main portion of the post. If
Mm,
you can't find a place that it deserves to be there, just don't include it at all. And so for this post, like what I think would probably be good to do is do kind of like a mini case study for the final section, very brief, just highlighting, we took X company through this audit framework just the other day and got them X lift in their, Google ads or whatever the thing is. If you want us to do this for you, like hop on a call or whatever the CTA is going to be, just an infinitely better ending than here's a grab bag of extra ideas.
yep. Yeah. And the way that I'd like to think about endings too is it's like, how do we use that, like going into using like filmmaking as an example, people will remember the beginning and the end more than anything else. So how can you use that end as like the drive to like inspire and like bring all of that to a head? Like how do you use that as the crescendo to take the next step? So yeah, perfect. All right. Stopping the screen share here. There we go. Perfect. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the distribution and your view on that these days.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, my specialty is SEO. So anywhere I'm working, I'm looking to primarily leverage SEO distribution. That said, obviously I'm coming in as a director of content marketing, not a director of SEO at owner.com. So at some point I'm going to be looking to build into more multi-channel. And I think the process there is very similar to what you just mentioned in pointing out the better, the medium that video would bring to the table. It's not about forcing another channel. I don't even think it's necessarily, I think there is some value to being everywhere to some extent. Like you want to show up if someone's looking for you across different channels. But every little piece of investment you do in terms of content should have a measurable um, ROI or a goal ROI at least. And so, looking at like, hey, as you're building out this SEO driven content, what aspects of this really don't fit written content? Because a lot of stuff doesn't. There's a lot of stuff that written content is just not a good fit for. And then you're looking at what is a good fit for this content and how is this tap into other forms of demand. Like when we talk about video content, we're not necessarily just looking in search to see what the search demand is. We're looking at, what's driving conversation. What popular channels, what are their most popular videos? What's the stuff that's really working well? What are the things that are trending? Tapping into those, whether it's evergreen trends or more temporary trends. Um, it's just every channel is its own approach, and you really have to treat it that way. Like even what you talked about with creating video and turning it into like a drip series. Like if you were to create a video based drip series and you're looking to use YouTube as like a front end for bringing people in as well, how you approach those videos is going to be very specific to YouTube. And you can take some of that video and repurpose it to add it to the blog or to share it on LinkedIn. Um, in some ways, but you're often going to need to retool unless you're just creating a lot of content and you can edit it and you can do different edits for different channels. Like you really have to be intentional about every channel you approach,
Yeah.
stuff, just kind of grabbing stuff and repurposing it across multiple channels without really creating it intentionally for those rarely, works out very well. Rarely really
Yeah.
gets in there. In some ways, it even detracts,
We
especially
talk
if
about that a lot behind the scenes on this show too, is like the best way to view this show is live, right? Because we have this very live and interactive format. When we republish to YouTube, you lose something a little bit, right?
yeah,
So we have to re-edit it in a way that feels more native to the platform.
yeah.
And then when it's repurposed in multiple ways, you're talking about speaking the language of the platform that you're using.
You do, but even there, like if you can hit a certain critical mass in terms of live engagement, people
Yeah.
are gonna be, people who are gonna watch on YouTube are gonna ask the same questions that people in the live audience. So if you can
Yeah.
facilitate that live culture of getting people to engage with questions, even in that YouTube experience, you're gonna be having enough crossover there with as
Yep.
people think of the question, someone throws that question in the chat and then we answer it live. And so they get to enjoy that as well.
Yeah, and you're finding content market fit. Actually, that point that we're talking about though leads to a really great one of the questions here where it says, I'm writing a thought leadership post for one of our senior C-level leaders about app intelligence software. I have a structure approved, but it's very standard stuff like what advice do you have making a piece like this impress? Uh, give it that little spark.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first question I would ask there is, are they just approving structure or are they contributing to input? Because, if the idea is that you're providing insight into what the most senior person at our company is thinking on this topic, and they're not providing any thinking on that topic, like you're kind of in a lose lose scenario there. So, I mean, your best bet there is to go find another company that's talking about the same thing, but is having their senior thinkers add to this content and kind of try to play off of that. But you're not really in a scenario there that's designed for your benefit or for the benefit of the content. It really like you have to get in thought leadership content, even more than anything else, you have to have, you know, on the ground insights being delivered to make it good. One thing I did when one of the first content marketing gigs that I worked, it was a small CRO agency that was trying to compete with their content against, Tommy's old company, CXL. We're trying to get rankings in this space with a very well established leader in the space, CXL, as well as like, $100 million A/B testing software companies that were doing content, things like that. And so, and I was creating all the content on a shoestring budget with no firsthand experience. But what I did have is I was able to get a list of other CRO experts who knew the owner at the company that I was working for. So not only could I get some feedback from the person I was working with, but also his whole network of actual on the ground experts, um, all had a good relationship with him. He had been doing content for a while, so they, there was this um, ecosystem there that I could tap into to get, experienced insights on anything that I needed. And I had to use it strategically. I couldn't take like the lazy route of just asking generic questions for every article and trying to stick it in. I had to think about what question is going to be manageable, accessible to access to answer from people with limited, free time, but is going to pull out a more unique insight on this topic that I can't deliver myself or find elsewhere. Um, and I leverage the hell out of that thing. I use that as, I split the list into groups so that I could not hit everyone on the same content. I could hit different people for different content and get insights for as much content as possible. And we created some really phenomenal, content that hit top rankings for topics that I had no firsthand experience with because I wasn't trying to deliver it myself. I wasn't trying to just
Right.
force, and I was pulling from real expertise.
One of our first episodes, we had Tracy Wallace, who's now at Klaviyo, and she had said something that I think has really stood out to me ever since is that thought leadership is a result, not a format. And that really, like, just hearing that little quote has really kind of shifted my perspective on that
Yes.
because, like, you can't outsource your knowledge or your thoughts to somebody without also getting on the ground with it. So, as a freelancer or somebody whose job it is to extract that, I think one of the best pieces of advice that I can give is try your best to ingratiate yourself with that person and get them in a no BS type of mood, right? Try to get them as unfiltered on their thoughts as possible,
Yeah.
because from there you can refine them and give them more PR approved situation,
Yeah.
but try to get them out of their head so you can like really get what their thoughts really are.
Yeah.
Um,
And since we have a lot of freelancers watching this, like, pick your battles. Like, you're you're gonna have a lot of clients that you work with who they're never going to give you the tools you need. They're never going to give you the budget you need. Don't try to force gold in those situations. Look like look for your opportunities. Wait, like look for the client who's going to give you access to like the CEO, like when you're, who's going to give you access to a group of customers who can give you like real customer information. Like, look for opportunities where a client, even if maybe they don't have the budget to really, but they give you the access. And so
mhm,
you can use the access to create, phenomenal content in this space. And even though you're really not going to get paid for that piece of content like you deserve, you can leverage that content to go get the pay that you do deserve with someone else. But you can't do that for every client. Like
right.
you don't want to be, just like busting your ass for no pay for everyone. You look for the select moments where you do a little more work than the client deserves, but you're doing it for you. You're doing it so you can test your chops on a really high end piece. And you look to kind of just do that here and there. Any place that you get a little extra opportunity, you work with a client who actually fucking split tests. Like the rare unicorn that actually does some performance testing, and you leverage the hell out of that. You do your absolute best because you're going to get data on that piece that you're not going to get for the next 10 clients you come across. So you just want to be picking your battles. And you do, like, yes, there's a place to do unpaid work or more work than the gig deserves, but you're calling your shot. You're choosing when the access that you're getting or the variables that you're working with line up to give you a chance to make that next move in your career. And then it's not, you never want to be in a situation where you're just paying your dues, where you're vaguely, grinding more than what you're being paid for, hoping someone's going to notice you, hoping you're going to benefit. You always do it on your terms, but you
Yep.
still have to do it. Like, you still have to look for those opportunities. You still have to be willing to pursue the gig that's going to give you better access, better data, even if the pay isn't quite there. But again, just be selective, and look for opportunities to really stretch yourself and deliver something exceptional, that's going to help you kind of leapfrog up the ladder throughout your career.
And at the end of the day, you work for you.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah. Um, well, we're actually a little overtime, which makes me very happy because this was a great conversation. Jacob, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody else, if we are, you will get the replay out in your email sometime within the next 24 to 48 hours. We're going to cut this together, make it nice and pretty for you. And also, if you are interested, you can catch up on the replays of our former episodes before. And if you would like to see any other replays, please check out the YouTube channel. We'll put that in the chat here. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of the night.